Chapter 4, At Flourish and Blouts. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life in Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Tuck in your shirt, Scruffy!" The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was in fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4 helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so he could bombard him with questions about life with muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say, as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious, really. How many ways have muggles found of getting along without magic?" Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered the room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellow parchment, addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You two have got them too," he added, as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pyjamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they all read their letters. Harry's told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September the 1st. There was also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, by Miranda Goshawk, Break with a Banshee, by Gilderoy Lockhart, Gadding with Ghouls, by the Gilderoy Lockhart, Holidays with Hags, by Gilderoy Lockhart, Travels with Trolls, by Gilderoy Lockhart, Voyages with Vampires, by Gilderoy Lockhart, Wanderings with Werewolves, by Gilderoy Lockhart, and Year with the Yeti, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new Defence Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan, but it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things second hand." "Oh, are you starting at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molten grey feather duster. At least, that's what Harry thought it was, until he saw it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting the letter from under its wing. "Finally, he's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him on it. But Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. "Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there, hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay, and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once, and perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course." "How can she be?" said Ron in horror. "We're on holiday, and we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione." "Well, that fits in nicely. We can go and get all your things then too," said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. "What are you all up to today?" Harry, Ron, Fred and George were planning to go up the hill to the small paddock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there, as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown away over the village, so instead they threw apples for each other to catch. They took it in turn to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulder, and they asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he said he was too busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtime so far. He stayed shut up in his room the rest of the time. "I wish I knew what he was up to," said Fred, frowning. "He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did. 12 hours, and he hardly gloated at all." "Ordinary wizarding levels," George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. "Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame." Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt working for the Wizard Bank, Gringotts. "Don't know how Mum and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year," said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything." Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that Harry's parents had left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had money. You couldn't use galleons, stickles and nuts in muggle shops. He'd never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday, and after a quick half-a-dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats, and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. "We're running low, Arthur," she sighed. "We'll have to buy some more today." "Oh, well, guess first, after you, Harry dear." She offered him the flower pot, and Harry stared at them all, watching him. What am I supposed to do?" he stammered. "He's never travelled by Floo powder," said Ron suddenly. "Sorry, Harry, I forgot." "Never," said Mr. Weasley. "But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year?" I went on the Underground." "Really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Were there escapators? How exactly—" "Not now, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me if you've never used it before." "It'll be all right, Mum," said Fred. "Harry, watch us first." He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up to the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it and shouted, "Diagon Alley," and vanished. "You must speak clearly, my dear," said Mrs. Weasley to Harry, as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. "And mind you get out at the right gate." "The right what?" said Harry nervously, as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. "Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know, but as long as you've spoken clearly—" "He'll be fine, Molly, don't fuss," said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder too. "But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain to his aunt and uncle?" "They wouldn't mind," Harry reassured her. "Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that." "Well, all right. You go after Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going." "And keep your elbows tucked in," Ron advised. "And your eyes shut," said Mrs. Weasley, "because of the soot." "Don't fidget," said Ron, "or you might well fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George." Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. "Diagon Alley!" he coughed. It felt as if it had been sucked down a giant plug hole. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his eyes was deafening, and he tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were flapping his face. Squinting through his eyes, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of rooms beyond. His bacon sandwiches were churning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then he fell face forward into cold stone and felt his glasses shatter. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses up to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where was he? He had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in the stone fireplace of what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop, but nothing in here was ever likely to be on Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withered hand on a cushion, a blood-stained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks leered down from the walls, and an assortment of human bones lay upon the counter. rusty, spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. The sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging where it hit the hearth, Harry made his way swiftly and silently towards the door, but before he got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass, and one of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot and wearing broken glasses. It was Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside it and pulled the doors to, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man who followed could have been his father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold grey eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at the items on display, rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not in the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry got a Nimbus 2000 last year, Harry Potter. Special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart. Wonderful Potter with his scar and his broomstick. You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son. "And I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less fond of Harry Potter, not when most of our kind regard him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man appeared behind the counter, smoothing his grey hair back from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borgin, in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted, and young Mr. Malfoy too, charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you just in today. Very reasonably priced." "I'm not buying today, Mr. Morgan, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unravelling it for Mr. Morgan to read. "I have a few items at home. It might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Morgan fixed a pince-nez to his nose and looked down the list. "The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surely?" Mr. Malfoy lips curled. "I've not been visiting yet." The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect, yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumours about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt that flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it. Harry felt a hot surge of anger. "And as you can see, certain of these poisons might make it appear—" "I understand, of course, sir," said Mr. Borgin. "Let me see. Can I have that?" interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. "Ah, the hand of glory," said Mr. Morgan, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. "Insert a candle, and it gives you light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir."